Hey everyone, and welcome to another online lecture. For this week, we're going to take it relatively easy and look at just one piece, the Roland Barthes piece from Myth Today. To get started, I want to tell you a little bit about Barthes. Barthes was a French structuralist and semiotics, right? He studied semiotics as per which we explored a little bit in our piece that we read by Ellen Sider. And so he's, of course, influenced by Saussure and the whole idea of the sign, right? You remember how the sign is the basic unit in semiology, kind of like the atom um, in physics, right? So, what I guess how do I explain this? What Barth really wanted to do, right, was he decided that he wanted to explore ideology in popular culture, right? And so that ideology often masquerades as common sense, right? So what he decides to do is he sits down, he writes this book, and the book is called Mythologies, and the piece that we read, Myth Today, is from Mythologies. And what he tries to do is apply semiotics to popular culture. So this book is a whole bunch of different essays looking at essentially different pieces of popular culture and trying to apply semiotics to this culture or these cultural artifacts and sort of figure out what's going on, trying to lay bare the work of ideology within these popular culture artifacts. So he sort of outlines his aims, what he wants to do at the beginning of this. And he says, so he wants to apply semiology to popular culture. Number two, he wants to make explicit what often remains implicit in the texts and practices of popular culture. So what he's talking about there is the idea that ideology often sort of hides itself. And so he's trying to lay it bare. He's trying to make it explicit. And one of the ways that he does this, point number three, is he interrogates what he calls the falsely obvious and the what goes without saying. So this relates back to Gramsci's idea that ideology masquerades as common sense. And so what Barthes is trying to do is he's trying to look at culture and specifically the things that we just assume to be true, right? The things that seem obvious but aren't really obvious, right? And don't really go without saying. And in these moments, he thinks he can reveal ideology at work, right? And so, in essence, his ultimate goal then is to explain the theoretical assumptions behind the study of popular culture. So from there, he wants to address, what is myth, right? Because the essay is entitled Myth Today. And so he gives us kind of two ways of thinking about it. The first one is that myth consists of ideas or practices which defend the status quo and actively promote the interests and values of the dominant classes in society. Clearly, this almost matches exactly our Marxist definition of ideology. So the link here, hopefully, is very clear to you with all the reading we've done up to this point. Then his second way of thinking about it is, he says that what happens is that myth turns the cultural and historical into the natural and the taken for granted. So again, there's two things going on. So the first way of thinking about myth, and these go together really. They're not two separate ways of looking at it, but two dimensions of the same way of looking at it, let's say. And so the first one, again, is that myth is the ideas or the behaviors which defend the status quo, that keep the dominant dominant. So this is ideological, right? And then he says the second thing is that these myths work to make ideology, make these myths work to make themselves seem natural or taken for granted, as if that's the way things should always be, right? This is what one of the things we discussed with regard to Marx and his idea of false consciousness, and the conception that we, in essence, ideology hides the real conditions of our existence from us, and we have an imaginary relationship with it, and this imaginary relationship is made up of common sense. Like, of course, things are that way, right? That's just the way they are, but they don't have to be that way. And that's sort of the point of ideology, is when there's a choice to make it seem as if there isn't, right? I hope that makes sense. I know we're getting a little abstract. So, in an effort to try and clarify this a little bit, I'll give you some examples. I've consistently maintained throughout my academic career that there is a bias in Western culture against learning and knowledge, right? I would suggest to you that although we give a lot of lip service to the idea of going to school and learning and how important knowledge is, right? Many of our most fundamental stories are stories about the dangers of learning. And so we can trace this back, right? We could trace this back all the way to things like the Bible and Adam and Eve, who eat from the tree of knowledge. And as a result, their punishment is that they're banished from the Garden of Eden, from paradise. We have Icarus, who flew too close to the sun, right? Who makes these wax wings, and this is from Greek mythology. And he flies too close to the sun, and his wings melt, and he falls to the earth. And again, the idea is he's trying to learn, right? He's trying to explore, and is punished for it. We have the myth of Prometheus, where Prometheus steals fire from the gods and shares that knowledge with man, and is eternally punished by being chained to a rock. And because he's immortal, right? This bird comes every day and eats out his liver. Right? And then, of course, we have Goethe's Faust, another famous story in Western civilization about a man who's essentially an academic who sells his soul to Satan for knowledge. And, of course, it doesn't work out well in most of the versions of the story. Then, even beyond this, as I think I pointed out before, we have a whole bunch of sayings in Western cultures that indicate that learning is bad, right? Or learning can be negative. Curiosity killed the cat. Right? What you don't know won't hurt you. I would suggest to you that these are all deeply ideological stories. Right? The idea, of course, being that you keep people ignorant in order to maintain the status quo. The people in power hold the information, they stay in power, and the subaltern or the oppressed classes, the working classes, don't ever learn enough to really understand their situation or change it. And so as a result, what they do is they tell us a bunch of stories where it looks like learning too much can be really bad for us. And so it just seems natural that we want to stay ignorant, right? So this is what happens with myth, is that we tell these stories that on one level just seem like stories, just seem like pleasant, well, maybe not pleasant, but they just seem like regular narratives. But when we begin to think about them on another level, we see ideology at work. And what Barthes was trying to do specifically was unmask this ideology using semiotics and expose, the myth or the ideology, that lies kind of at the center of these tales. So that's what he's trying to do with this essay. So he goes on thinking about myth, and he tells us, myth is a type of speech, right? It's a system of communication. It's a mode of signification. It's a way of communicating. But he says the object of its message does not define myth, but by the way in which it utters this message. So it's not so much about the actual story that's being told, but rather sort of the way it's being told and the deeper message. And so he goes on and he says, listen, you shouldn't just think about myth as speaking or even writing, right? I mean, anything can be myth because it can be a picture, it could be a film, it could be a TV show, right? It could be something that you see on the web, it could be a YouTube video. Of course, they didn't have that when Barthes was writing, but you get the idea, right? And so he says, if you're going to study myth, the best way to do it is with semiology. The science that we talked about with Sider previously. So Barthes' point here, and it becomes somewhat complicated because he says that myth is a second-order semiological system, and I realize this begins to seem very complicated because he uses very complicated language. He tells us that myth is the meta-language in which one speaks about the first semiological system. And then I have all these equations down here, and it all looks very difficult, but I'll try and make it as simple for you as I can. What he's saying when he says that myth is a second-order semiological system is that when we read a story, we can understand the plot of the story. We can understand the basic narrative. But that's only one level, right? One order of signification. That's just the, what we would call the denotative meaning of the story, right? So there's another level though, and that's the connotative level, and that's the second order level. And connotation relates to all the sort of the messages that lie within that story but aren't spelled out, right? So, for example, words function denotatively and connotatively all the time. So, an example of this would be, let's take the word gay, right? So, to be gay, the dictionary definition of gay, at least back in the day when I was a kid, was to be happy, right? Now, of course, I could use the word gay with that meaning in mind, right? We had a gay old time. We had a lot of fun. But on the connotative level, there's another level to that word, and that's associated with homosexuality, right? So on one level, there's the denotative meaning, which is sort of the dictionary meaning, but then there's this connotative meaning, which goes beyond that. And Barthes would say that that's a second order meaning. And so what he's telling us is that when we read a story, right, we can understand them as myths that function like allegories, like Plato's allegory of the cave, right? So we read the allegory of the cave, and the denotative meaning of the allegory of the cave is all about these prisoners who bound up in a cave and forced to look at a wall with shadows and so on. But on the connotative level, it can tell us something about true knowledge, about the dangers of knowledge, about society, right? And that's the second order level, right? That's the allegorical level. And so that's really what he's saying here, is that in the first order system, we can analyze it using semiology, the same way that Sider does, and say, okay, this is, we're studying a bunch of signifiers and signifieds, which equal signs, right? And we can understand words in terms of their most basic meanings, but there's this second order level. And on the second order level, the signs fill in for the signifier, right, on this second order level and create a new kind of meaning. So, based on this, Barthes tells us the semiologist can treat writing and pictures in the same way as signs, right? And so we can interpret them, for lack of a better term, on the connotative level. So here's an example, right? And this is a famous passage, and of course it's not terribly politically correct, so I apologize for that. But what Barthes is getting at here is he's examining a copy of a magazine called Paris Match, and he's sitting in the barber shop or wherever, right? And he's looking at this picture. And he says, one way to look at this picture is just to see this young man, right, who's saluting the French flag, right? That's the denotative level. But then he goes on and he says, we can look at it on the level of myth or on the connotative level. And that is that this is a colonized youth, right? And he could say, I see very well what it signifies to me, that France is a great empire, that all her sons, without any color discrimination, faithfully serve under a flag, and there's no better answer to the detractors of colonialism than the zeal shown by this boy, blah, 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 right? So the whole idea here is that even though this is just a picture of a young child saluting a flag, it has all kinds of other meanings associated with it, right? Second order meanings. And this is where myth operates, right? So he goes on and he says, listen, we can read myth in different ways, right? We can do it a kind of journalistic reading, right? This is kind of a cynical meaning, right? We could focus on the symbols. Our reading in this sense is static, right? The intentions are made obvious. And he would say, we don't really want to do this. This is when you read it and you just take away the story, let's say. And then he says there's a mythologistic reading where we focus on the full signifier, right? Where we could take apart the myth and we could consider what the myth does to the meaning, right? And we could sort of demystify what's going on. We can search for the connotative meaning. And then finally, there's the semiological philosophical reading that we can do. And he says it focuses on the signifier as a whole, comprised of meaning and form. And it says it consumes its myth according to its own structure. Reading is dynamic Myth is seen at the same time as both true and unreal. And of course, this is where he really wants everyone to get, right? He wants you to be able to look at the myth and understand it on different levels, right? To understand the falseness of the myth, but to some extent, perhaps understand its truth as well, right? Because ideology is, to some extent, well, perhaps to put it better, we could say that ideology, to some extent, constructs our truth. And so we need to see how that's done, right? And the best way to do this is with this semi-logical, philosophical kind of reading. So from here, he goes on and he wants to talk about what does myth do? What's its function? And he says that essentially what it does is it naturalizes whatever its ideology is, right? So when I tell you a story, when I tell you a myth story, you think of this story as just an innocent story, right? But this isn't because the story's innocent. I don't even really try to hide my meaning, right? It's just that you look at whatever that ideology is behind the story as common sense. So if I tell you a story, for example, about a young man who works really hard and gets ahead and eventually becomes CEO of his company because he worked so hard and worked his way up from the mailroom, or started as a janitor and worked really hard and then eventually became the CEO. You're going to look at this story and you might think that it's a little unrealistic, but you're not going to think the idea of working hard and getting ahead is unreasonable, right? It seems natural. And so, the intentions of me telling you this story aren't hidden. The message is there in plain sight, but it just seems natural. So we don't even think twice about it, right? And so as a result, you can sit there and kind of consume the myth innocently because it all seems so natural. It doesn't seem arbitrary or man-made, right? It just seems like the way things are supposed to be. And that's the way myth works. And there are plenty of myths like this, right? The American dream myth, for example, is similar to the work hard and get ahead. Not identical, but it's similar. And in that myth, what you do is, you grow up, you go to school, you study, you go out, you get a job, and then you go out and you buy a house in the suburbs with a white picket fence, and have a minivan and 2.5 kids. Now, this might seem like common sense or completely reasonable, but I mean, it isn't really, is it? I mean, it's very ideological. The idea that success means having a family, that it means having a very specific kind of family with a certain number of kids and living in a very specific place, and it's got all this ideological charge in it, right? That perhaps we don't fully see. So what this does, of course, is that with myth, it gives historical intention and natural justification. So what he's saying here is that, again, the myth makes things appear natural, right? That events that had happened in the past, couldn't have turned out any other way. And of course they could have, right? So that's what he's saying when he says myth has the task of making contingency appear eternal, and that myth is constituted by the loss of the historical quality of things. Right? What he means by this is that we, again, by assuming that something is natural, for example, I mean, take a controversial topic like marriage, right? For a long time, the argument against gay marriage in this country was that marriage was between a man and a woman, and everybody knows this. Now, this makes it seem like this is, of course, the way it should be, right? It's natural. It's the way it should always be. But, I mean, obviously we've seen recently that isn't necessarily true, right? That rather that's a man-made definition of marriage, and it could be changed. And indeed, in some cases, has been, right? So the idea here is that, when we think of those things, when you hear an argument like, well, that's the way it's always been, that's a deeply ideological argument. I mean, it might be true that that's the way it's always been, but that's also an ideological argument because it conceals the fact that it could have been another way, right? And so when he gives us this semi-logical definition of myth, when he tells us that myth is depoliticized speech, he doesn't mean that myth isn't political. He means that myth doesn't seem political when we read it or hear it, right? It tries to hide its politics. These stories, myth tries to hide its ideology. It tries to hide its politics and appear as nature rather than politics, right? Okay, well that's it. I made this week, kind of quick, and I'm sure you don't mind. And hopefully I covered this fairly enough. These are kind of complicated ideas, but I try and make them as simple as I can. So hopefully I was effective. If you have any questions, as always, hit me up. Thanks.